Choitalidi, I'll just give a
Hello.
just a short. Yeah, Choitalidi, we can hear you. So I'll just give a very brief background as the Senior Vice President of ACTA West Bengal. That it was one of our dreams to create a program which was exclusively for students in who are members of ACTA in West Bengal. And this masterclass series is our humble endeavor towards executing that dream. And today, the moderator of the session is Dr. Choitali Sengupta, and I hand over the program to Dr. Choitali to take it forward from here. Choitali, please.
Thank you. I'm not Choitali Dasgupta. I'm Dr. Choitali Sengupta. It's no doctor. It's a.
Choitali, your voice is breaking. No, not very clear.
No, not very clear. Okay, 1 minute.
Now it is a little better.
Sure, sir. Sure.
Oh, it's okay. It's
Yeah.
okay now.
How to get the
Okay.
full screen?
Dr. Mulin, who is famous worldwide. He is senior consultant and professor and director of anesthesia critical care in Narayana. He is
Choitali, can we start Shotojit's presentation? Hello?
Dr. Chaitali, can you hear us?
Sir, I think we will start the presentation then. The students are here, so we will start.
Yeah, you can start.
Okay. Shotojit, please start the presentation.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, very good afternoon, sir. Sir, should I give the summary or full presentation?
Do you have the full case with you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, let us see you present the case.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Then we can summarize.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is the particulars of the patient. Patient is Mita Roy, 33 years female patient, homemaker by occupation, is a resident of Kolkata. His date of admission is 26th August and date of examination is 29th August. Her chief complaints is the breathlessness for the last 6 months and the sweating and palpitation for the last 1 month. And for the last 1 month, she was also having cough. History of present illness, patient was apparently normal 6 months before. Breathlessness started 6 months ago and it is gradually progressive in nature. It is exertional, non-seasonal and associated with mild limitations of physical activity with her normal household work. She also experienced one episode of respiratory distress at the middle of the night, which made her awake from the sleep and rushed to the window for the fresh air, and it was relieved by sitting on a stool. Apart from this episode, occasionally she felt mild dyspnea on lying down position, and it is of such a degree as to make her sit upright for relief. She often uses extra pillow at night for sleeping. She also complains of bilateral pedal edema for the last 2 weeks, which is pitting in nature. She also complains of sweating and palpitation on mild exertion, but not associated with chest pain. She also complains of cough for the last 1 month. It is non-productive, dry cough, not associated with any wheeze, not associated with systemic symptoms like febrile episode, malaise, or anorexia, etc. Not associated, not improved with bronchodilator therapy, and not associated with hemoptysis at present. Regarding past history, she gives a history of frequent episode of fever with sore throat and arthritis in her childhood, for which she was received medications at regular interval, but suddenly she discontinued her medication. She gives a history of open heart surgery for similar kinds of symptoms nearly 11 years ago. No past history of tuberculosis, malaria, hypertension, or diabetes was present. Regarding personal history, she is married, having one children, 8 years of age. She is a homemaker and she is a non-smoker. Regarding menstrual history, menarche at the age of 13 years, durations of menstruation average 4 days, no other irregularities. And regarding obstetric history, her last childbirth was 8 years ago, and it was institutional vaginal delivery and it was uneventful. Regarding treatment history, she received one intramuscular injection in her childhood every 21 days interval for 2 years, and then he stopped suddenly. Now she is on following medication: tab furosemide 20 milligram twice a day, tab digoxin 0.25 milligram 5 days in a week, tab metoprolol 25 milligram twice a day, and syrup Potclor 5 milligram twice a day with a regular blood report of serum potassium. And regarding physical examination, in general survey, patient was conscious, alert, cooperative. His apparent age is corroborative of her age. His decubitus of choice is semi-recumbent positions in the bed. Nutrition is average build. And in faces, there is a bluish discoloration in the perioral region, particularly in the lips. There is no pallor or anemia, no cyanosis, no jaundice. Neck vein is engorged and pulsatile. Neck vein is engorged and pulsatile. GVP is raised. It is measured 11 centimeter of blood column, and hepatojugular reflex was absent at that time. There is no clubbing. Lymph node not palpable. There is bilateral pedal edema, which is pitting in nature. Blood pressure is 90 by 60 millimeter of mercury in supine position. Pulse is 110 per minute. It's a low volume, irregularly irregular pulse. No radioradial or radiofemoral delay. All the peripheral pulses are palpable. Neither any abnormality in the arterial wall nor any special character is present. Regarding systemic examination, cardiovascular examination, inspection. Inside precordium, no shape, no deformity or bulging is present. Pulsation, no obvious pulsation is present. Scar mark, a midline scar mark present over the sternum. Outside precordium, no obvious deformity was present. In palpation, mitral area. Apex bit is palpated in the 6th intercostal space, half inch outside the mid-clavicular line. A systolic thrill is present in the apical area, which is best palpated in the left lateral positions and at the height of expiration. In pulmonary area, there is palpable P2, left parasternal heave also present, and in tricuspid and aortic area, there is normal and percussion is not done. Regarding auscultation, mitral area, first heart sound is soft, and in mitral area, 2 murmur was audible. First is a low-pitched mid-diastolic rumbling murmur of grade 4 intensity. It is audible in the mitral area without any radiation. Another soft blowing pansystolic murmur of grade 3 intensity, also audible in the mitral area, which is best heard in the left lateral positions and at the height of expiration. And this murmur is radiated towards the left axilla and the inferior angle of the left scapula. Second heart sound is also audible S3 and S4 was not audible at present. In pulmonary area, P2 is audible and loud. There is a ejection systolic murmur in pulmonary area. In tricuspid area, there is also a systolic murmur which increases in intensity during inspiration and not conducted towards axilla. And aortic area is both the heart sounds are audible with no murmur, no split, click or rub. Regarding respiratory system examination, inspection, upper respiratory tract is within normal limit. Respiratory rate is 16 per minute, regular. Chest movement was normal, no obvious venous prominence. Accessory muscles of respirations are not working at the present moment. Absence of intercostal suction, no obvious scoliosis, kyphosis or drooping of shoulder present. Regarding palpation, temperature, surface temperature is normal, no tenderness, positions of the trachea is in the midline, movement of the chest normal, both in inspiration and expiration, vocal phlegmatus is equal on both sides, percussions not done. Regarding auscultations, vesicular breath sound in the both sides, vocal resonance is normal in both sides, no rhonchi found, but there is basal crepitations on both sides. No pleural rub was detected. In GI tract examinations, liver is a mild enlargement, soft, but there is tender. And spleen not palpable, ascites absent at that time. Nervous system examinations with a normal limit. With this history and examinations, I am coming to this provisional diagnosis. This is a case of mixed mitral valve lesion, MS and mitral stenosis and mitral regurgitation, probably rheumatic in origin, with pulmonary hypertension and atrial fibrillations, with NOAJ grade 3. Now patient is in congestive cardiac failure and the patient has a history of previous cardiac surgery. Sir, I have investigations and echocardiography. Should I go there?
No, first we will go through the clinical diagnosis based on
Yes.
the history, physical examination.
Yes, sir.
So your first diagnosis is rheumatic heart disease with mixed mitral valve lesion, mitral stenosis and mitral regurgitation. Patients with pulmonary hypertension, atrial fibrillation, NYHA grade 3. Congestive heart failure at present patient with
A history of previous
giving a
cardiac
history of
surgery.
previous cardiac surgery. This is what the summary you have made.
Yes.
Yeah. This is the diagnosis you have made provisionally based on the history and physical findings.
Yes, sir.
So in this, you have to substantiate your diagnosis. So you said the rheumatic heart disease. What is the reason? On what basis do you say that this is rheumatic heart disease?
So patient having, first from the history, patient having the history of recurrent episode of fever,
Yes.
arthralgia and sore throat in her childhood.
Right.
For which he has taken irregular medications, but which is stopped abruptly in her childhood. And after a period of 15-20 years, he develops similar kinds of symptoms. And
That's right. That's right. What do you mean by rheumatic fever?
It is caused by group A beta hemolytic streptococci, and for the immunological reason, the M protein of the bacteria causes the cross reactivity with the myocardium and other structures of the heart, and that causes the lesions in the myocardium and the valvular structures of the heart, and that causes the rheumatic heart disease due to rheumatic fever in the
No. How do you diagnose rheumatic fever?
Okay.
I'm asking. Rheumatic fever.
Okay, sir. Rheumatic fever can be diagnosed according to the Jones criteria. There are
good. Yeah.
there are the major criteria and the minor criteria. And I mean, major criteria, there is a carditis, arthritis, subcutaneous nodule, chorea, Sydenham's chorea,
chorea,
and erythema marginatum.
erythema marginatum. So patient had a history of rheumatic fever in the past, when she was a child or young adolescent, and then she has developed this disease. So you are basing this disease because of the symptomatology, history, and the previous cardiac surgery which was done. That history is available. So you are actually helped because of the presence of history of rheumatic fever. Is the rheumatic fever invariably present in patients who have rheumatic heart disease, history of rheumatic fever?
Not always present.
Yeah, it is not invariable, that's right. The patient may have had rheumatic fever, but might have had, did not notice it. She might have had little fever, sore throat, and might have thought that it's some usual common cold and missed it. And then actually had developed rheumatic heart disease. You did mention about NYHA. What is NYHA?
So this is the New York classification grading for the dyspnea. Class 1 is there is no limitations of ordinary activity. Class
Yes.
2 is mild limitations of normal household activity. Class
Yes.
3 is a marked limitation of his daily activity, and class 4 is the not possible no activity is possible of ordinary activity. There is a
Patient is dyspneic at rest.
Yes,
Yeah,
at
that's
rest.
right. That's right. So this patient is categorized into which classification? Which, depending on the NYHA grading?
I think it is a grade 3 classification. There is a marked limitations of activity of normal household work.
But the patient also gives a history of paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea.
Yes, sir. Is in paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea, it is usually grade 4, but grade 3 and grade 4 usually.
So what is this paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea?
It is basically the distress at the middle of the night due to the left-sided valvular heart disease. The mechanism are at night during the lying down positions.
Yeah.
There is a increased preload, and there is a reduced activity of there is a abolitions of the adrenergic activity, and during the REM movement of the sleep there is a tachycardia, and all this causes the aggravations of the left-sided lesions, and there is a pulmonary hypertension, pulmonary edema, interstitial edema, and that causes the distress at the middle of the night, and that is.
Is it pulmonary hypertension which causes distress?
Is
there any other candidate available to answer questions? Only you are there.
Yes, sir. 5 participants are there. Sir.
Oh, can I know their names?
Sir, myself, Dr. Soumitra Mukherjee.
Soumitra.
Good afternoon,
Mukherjee.
I am Dr.
Yes,
Prachi Nag, sir.
Say that again.
Dr.
I got it. Prachi Nag. Yeah. Next.
I'm Dr. Ashutosh Sahu, sir.
Sahu, okay.
Sam, I'm Dr. Stephen, sir.
Stephen, okay, Stephen. So we have 5 people participating in the discussion. So the question was, what was the question we were asking?
Sir, paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea and the causes of dyspnea.
Yeah. So you're telling about paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea. Soumitra, can you tell me why the patient had bluish discoloration of the lips? Perioral bluish discoloration.
Sir, because of the long-standing mitral stenosis, there will be persistent chronic low cardiac output and a compensatory peripheral vasoconstriction. The combination of low cardiac output and peripheral vasoconstriction causes peripheral cyanosis, which is manifested in the form of bluish discoloration.
You mentioned peripheral cyanosis. What do you mean by cyanosis?
So cyanosis is a condition when there is increase in the reduced hemoglobin concentration in the blood.
Is there any absolute value for that?
It should be more than 8 gram per DL.
8 gram or 5 grams?
Sir, 5 gram per DL.
It is usually mentioned as 5 grams. If it's more than 5 grams in the peripheral blood, the cyanosis will be manifest
Yes, sir.
clinically. Is it a central cyanosis or peripheral cyanosis in this case?
Sir, in this case, it is a peripheral cyanosis.
It's a peripheral cyanosis.
Yes,
What
sir.
are the causes for central cyanosis?
Central cyanosis can be seen in case of cyanotic congenital heart disease.
Cyanotic heart
in
disease.
heart
Yes.
disease. In case of with cyanotic heart disease with right left shunt. In case of severe pulmonary parenchymal disease like COPD, like in severe pneumonia.
Yes.
So these are the causes of central cyanosis.
That's good. Can you get a central cyanosis in a patient with left to right shunt? You said only right to left shunt. Can it happen in left to right shunt? You
Sir,
said
in
only right to left shunt. Can you see in left to right shunts as well? Can you see central cyanosis in a left to right shunt?
sir, in left right shunt, if there is a reversal of shunt,
Very
in
good.
future,
If there's a reversal of
reversal
shunt,
of
you can
shunt
see.
because of pulmonary hypertension, then there will be central cyanosis also.
So what are the lesions in the heart where there's mixing and they have, see, you mentioned only right to left shunt. Can it happen because of mixing of
Mix of the blood.
the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in the heart and then cause cyanosis?
Yes, sir.
And what are such lesions?
Sir, sir, I didn't get the question.
No, you mentioned as for central cyanosis, patient should have a right to left shunt.
Yes, sir.
Patient should have a right to left shunt. That is correct. Very good. That's commonest cause. So first, commonest should come first. So that is right. I would accept that. Now I want to, then we went to the left to right shunts causing cyanosis. That is because of increased PA pressure
Yes,
and
sir.
reversal of shunt. That's
Yes, sir.
correct. But in the congenital heart disease, there is also section of diseases where there is mixing. Need not necessarily be right left shunting. Just because of mixing, there will be cyanosis.
Sir, like total anomalous pulmonary venous connection,
Right.
there will be mixing of the blood and it will cause cyanosis. In truncus arteriosus, there is mixing of blood and that will cause cyanosis.
So when you say congenital heart disease, cyanotic congenital heart disease, we have to also look into the right to left shunt support and also mixing lesions.
Mixing type.
And then a reversal of shunt. So all
Yes,
these
sir.
things will be part of cyanotic congenital heart disease causing bluish discoloration, central
cyanosis. Yes, sir.
Now we'll go on to Dr. Prachi.
Yes, sir.
This patient had irregular pulse. What do you mean? What does that indicate?
So the presence of an irregular pulse means that the patient has an atrial fibrillation, sir.
Atrial fibrillation, that's commonest cause for irregular pulse. What do you mean by pulse deficit?
Sir, an apex pulse deficit is a condition where simultaneously one will listen with the stethoscope with the pulsations and the contractions of the heart, and the other one will palpate the peripheral pulse. So in cases, especially like atrial fibrillation, the atrial rate is high, but there is a conduction block and the ventricular rate is low. So as a result of which there is an apex pulse deficit. So this is what is the apex pulse deficit, sir. The conduction, like the peripheral conducted beats are the ventricular beats, which will be lower than what is the atrial beat that we hear, sir. This is the apex pulse deficit.
Is it a conduction block or what is the cause for pulse deficit? Is it conduction block?
Yes, sir. It's a conduction block, sir.
Where is the conduction block?
Sir, at the AV junction, sir.
AV junction. That is okay, but basically there are mixture of strong and weak beats. The stroke volume for each heartbeat will vary. Some of the weak beats may not be profiled in the periphery.
Yes, sir.
And that is the cause for the pulse deficit.
Pulse deficit, sir.
Okay, that is the cause for pulse deficit. What does it signify? If you have a patient has irregular pulse and you have the thought that it is atrial fibrillation, which I accept, that's the commonest thing. This is atrial fibrillation, of course. So what does that signify to you from a clinical point of view?
So clinical point of view, it could be the reason that the LA is enlarged, as a result of which
Very
there is
good. LA is
stretching of
enlarged.
the fibers of the LA, and it could be secondary to various reasons, sir. So yeah, the most commonly will be an obstruction to the forward flow from the LA to the LV, or there can be a regurgitant flow which causes increased blood backflow to the LA. So these are the two most common causes that we encounter in the cardiac setting, sir. That is causing enlarged LA.
That's true. Very good. And how does this atrial fibrillation influence the patient's course? Does it? There is no change in the patient's symptomatology, or what is the effect of atrial fibrillation, onset of atrial fibrillation on the patient's general well-being?
Sir, it depends on what is the pathology. Like here in the case of MS, once the atrial kick is gone, the contribution, that is the last 20% of the contribution, is also gone. Then in patient from the LA to the LV, that is the diastolic flow is from the LA to the LV, which is contributed by the atrial contraction in the last half of the diastole. So that is lost. Then in patients like HOCM or some HOCM, even in the same, they are very much dependent on this atrial kick for the forward flow. They need a very high preload, which is helped by the atrial contraction to fill up the.
What is the other common valvular lesion where atrial kick is very important? You said HOCM. There is any other commoner lesion which is where in which atrial kick is very important?
The mitral stenosis.
Mitral stenosis, yes, mitral stenosis. Any other common lesion, more common than HOCM, where atrial kick is very important?
I can't think as of now.
Sir, I think it is aortic stenosis. Aortic stenosis.
Aortic stenosis.
Okay, sir.
Important
okay, yes, sir.
definitely is thick and compliance is less. So for it to get filled up, we need the atrial kick, which is
yes, sir.
may contribute up to 40% of the left ventricular preload. So atrial stenosis is another condition where atrial kick is important. So here in mitral stenosis, because of the narrowed valve, atria has to contract strongly to be able to fill the left ventricle. So with the onset of atrial fibrillation, the atrial kick is lost. So what is the effect of this on the patient's general well-being?
So because of the loss, anyways, the orifice is very narrowed, sir. And with that, the atrial kick, the last 30% contribution is also lost. So there is still increase in the decreased forward flow, leading to a further decrease in the cardiac output of the patient.
Very good, very good. There is worsening of the heart failure and symptoms of decreased perfusion.
So forward, sir, its cardiac output is decreased. Backward is the increase in the symptomatology like dyspnea, pulmonary edema, and all.
Yeah, there is worsening of the heart failure.
Yes, sir.
That's what happens. And what else is, from our point of view, what else happens with the onset of atrial fibrillation? One is worsening of the heart failure, leading to more pulmonary congestion and decreased cardiac output, leading to fatigue and inability to do any sort of exercise. So, what is the other effect of atrial fibrillation?
Sir, there might be embolization, sir.
Very good. Thromboembolic phenomenon because of the stasis of blood in the left because of stenosis valve. Even otherwise, even if the valve is not stenosis, the patients with atrial fibrillation are likely to develop thromboembolic events. That's very good. How do you make out atrial fibrillation? How do you confirm the diagnosis of atrial fibrillation? You have found irregular pulse. So, how do you confirm it?
Sir, by the means of an ECG, sir.
Very good. ECG
there is absent.
Very good.
Absent P waves and irregular RR interval that signifies, especially lead 2 is the best lead to rule out atrial fibrillation, sir.
Okay. Then we'll ask Ashutosh Sharma. Sahu, sorry. Sahu. So this patient had 2 types of murmur, basically four murmurs. One was systolic murmur, one was diastolic murmur, one was ejection systolic murmur, and there was one other systolic murmur. Now, will you be able to tell me something about the ejection systolic murmur in the pulmonary area? He said there was ejection systolic murmur in the pulmonary area.
The registrant systolic murmur in pulmonary area may be due to increased pulmonary hypertension.
It is due to pulmonary hypertension. Okay, there was a mid-diastolic murmur. Can you describe mid-diastolic murmur in mitral stenosis?
The mid-diastolic murmur in mitral stenosis is a rumbling type of low-pitched rumbling type of murmur best heard in the peak of expiration. With the bell of the in the left lateral position and with the bell of the stethoscope.
Is there a pre-systolic accentuation?
The pre-systolic accentuation is there, sir.
Is there? Do you see pre-systolic accentuation in a patient with atrial fibrillation?
So in pre-systolic accentuation is due to atrial contraction, and AF in atrial fibrillation, it is absent.
It will not be seen. That's correct.
It will not be seen.
The second murmur he mentioned was systolic murmur, which was I don't know whether he mentioned that it was going towards the back side. What is that due to?
It is due to the mitral regurgitation murmur.
It is yeah, it is mitral. And he also mentioned another systolic murmur he mentioned. What is the difference between if I say yeah, tell me.
The other systolic murmur may be due to tricuspid regurgitation.
That is due to tricuspid regurgitation. If I say that this systolic murmur is because of aortic stenosis, how do you argue with me? No, sir, it's not aortic stenosis. How will you substantiate your this? This is systolic murmur, which is a little bit going to the back side. But I'll say that this patient has additional aortic valve disease, and with this aortic stenotic murmur causing systolic murmur.
Sir, in tricuspid murmur is heard in the tricuspid area, and is it and there may be the features of right ventricular failure and enlarged JVP may be raised, and features of right ventricular failure.
No, my question is, see, there is a systolic murmur, so we have to have a differential diagnosis. The differential diagnosis is aortic stenosis. Can this be aortic stenosis? Patient had a mitral valvotomy done. Now because the rheumatic heart disease can affect any valve, now patient has come with aortic stenosis. Is it possible? But based on the clinical findings, you have to tell me whether it's possible or
not. Aortic stenosis is possible.
Will it aortic stenosis cause a systolic murmur?
Yes, sir. Systolic murmur heard in the aortic area.
That is heard in aortic area.
Sir, it may radiate to the carotid.
Very good. It will go to the carotid, whereas mitral regurgitation will not go to the carotid.
No, sir.
It will not go to, and typically it is a crescendo decrescendo murmur. It will be diamond shaped, and it's ejectional systolic murmur. There's an ejection click when it starts to be heard. So this is most probably unlikely that the aortic valve is involved in this case as of now, because aortic sounds were normal in the aortic area. That's what my friend was telling us. So this is, can it be VSD? Patient has concomitant VSD.
So VSD murmur is a continuous type of murmur, and it's best heard in the apex.
And it's a continuous murmur is machinery murmur. They mean to say it's a machinery murmur. Where do you get machinery murmur?
I don't know, sir.
No, do you call continuous murmur in VSD? It's a pansystolic.
Yes, sir.
It's not continuous murmur. It is pansystolic.
Pansystolic and
pansystolic murmur. And where do you get continuous murmur?
Sir, in PDA we get continuous murmur.
Yeah, in PDA you get continuous Now we'll go to Stephen.
Yes, sir.
Stephen, this patient, JVP was raised, he said. How do you measure JVP?
JVP, I make the patient in a semi lying position at in the bed, and I will just.
Semi-lying means what exactly?
It's around 45 degrees.
Semi-recumbent.
Semi-recumbent position.
Semi-recumbent position. Very good.
I will use 2 scale. So one scale I will just I will just keep along the JVP wave of the top. I'll place this scale at along the JVP waves, and I'll put another scale perpendicular to the sternal angle. So from the lower scale to the topmost point where the JVP is seen, I'll measure the length of the distance. Then that I'll take it as a jugular venous pressure.
What will be the normal jugular venous pressure?
Normal jugular venous pressure is around 5 centimeters.
Yeah, 3 to 5 centimeters. That's correct. Yes, now, can you continue the investigations, whatever you have?
Yes, sir.
So clinically we think that this patient has rheumatic heart disease. Open mitral valvotomy was done, so this is sternotomy, and now come with restenosis and mixed valvular lesion, tricuspid regurgitation, and increased PA pressures.
Yes, sir. Sir, my slides are visible or not, sir?
Not as it.
Satyajit, you have to share your screen.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, now visible?
Now it's going to come.
Okay, okay, sir. Sir, should I continue, sir?
Yes. Investigations.
Yes, so investigations, regarding investigations, hemoglobin percentage is 9 gram per DL. Total leukocyte count is 6,500. Platelet count is 2.2 lakhs per cubic millimeter. ESR is 30 millimeter. CRP is 1.2. ASO is less than 150. And INR is 1.02. Creatinine is 0.73 and BARN is 10. And LFT within normal limit. We have done the ECG and chest X-ray and dental checkup also done. Now the echocardiography regarding LV.
ECG is over. ECG done.
Yes, sir. ECG said.
ECG is available.
Yes. No, sir. I have not.
ECG is not available. Okay. X-ray is available.
No, sir.
So what will you find in the ECG in this case? What do you expect to find?
So in ECG there is a atrial fibrillation, and so there is a irregularly there is a P wave, abnormal P wave. There is a fibrillary P wave, and there is a RR interval.
Please say that again. There will be abnormal P wave or what is it?
So there is a P wave. There is a no definite P wave. This is a fibrillary wave.
Yeah. There is no P wave.
Definite. And there is a RR interval is irregular.
Yes.
And in long-standing cases, there may be the RV hypertrophy is also there.
Yes. Okay. X-ray, what will you find in this case?
X-ray is I find the mitralizations of the heart. That is the straightening of the left heart border, and the full of pulmonary bay. There is a pulmonary features of pulmonary hypertension. There is a prominence of pulmonary arterial hypertension and peripheral and the peripheral pruning is there, and there is a enlargement of the left
pruning.
atrium.
What do you mean by pruning?
This is pruning is the narrowing of the pulmonary blood vessels in the periphery of the lung field, and that causes the pruning of the.
Do you see pruning in mitral valve disease? Pruning is typically seen in congenital heart disease, left to right shunts, when they develop the Eisenmenger syndrome.
Yes,
so, typically pruning word is not used here.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Okay, you will the heart size. What will happen to heart size?
Heart size will be increased. There is a cardiomegaly.
Cardiomegaly is expected, yes. And for lung fields?
Lung fields are congested due to
Lung
the
fields may be increased bronchopulmonary vascular
marking.
Things may be there. And in early cases, there will be diversion of blood flow to the upper lung fields.
Yes, sir.
And in addition, there will be sternal bias in this case.
Yes, sir.
Sternal bias in this case. Will you do a lateral X-ray for this case?
Sorry, sir.
Lateral X-ray for this case.
Yes, sir. Lateral X-ray will be done because it's a redo surgery.
So how does that help you?
It helps the adhesions between the anterior chest wall and the mediastinal structure. We can see in the lateral chest X-ray, the heart can be adhered to the anterior chest.
How does it help you? There will be additions. Huh?
Yes, sir. Is there is any additions, or in cases of regarding mitral, there is a enlargement of the left atrium.
Left atrial enlargement.
That can be appreciated.
No, I'm asking about left. Okay, lateral chest X-ray. How does it help you? We do X-ray in any redo case. No, how does it? What is the?
Sir, in lateral chest, we can find that there is any gap between the sternum and the mediastinal structure.
Very good, very good. That is the crux of the point, because you need to know how close the heart to the sternum, back of the sternum, so that you can classify patients into high risk sternotomy or not so high risk, depending upon the distance between the sternum, backside of the sternum, and the front wall of the heart. So that is one important thing. And in this case, actually we don't do it nowadays, but some old examiners may ask you the barium swallow.
Yes,
they used to do, and they may say that left atrial compression may cause dysphagia in these patients. So they would like to see the level of compression, but that is not being done now. I think you can forget it. So lateral chest X-ray is important from the point of view of sternotomy. Okay, now X-ray is done. Now you're talking about echocardiography. Yeah.
Yes, sir. In echocardiography, the left ventricle is normal in size, no RWMA, no regional wall of abnormality was detected. Ejection fraction 60%, and in grade 1 diastolic dysfunction, and interventricular septum is 1.1 centimeter. There is LA size is 50 millimeter, no LA thrombus was detected. RA size 35 millimeter, interatrial septum is intact, and RV function is normal, CAPSA is 19 millimeter. And regarding mitral valve, there is a thickened mitral valve leaflet with a restricted mitral valve opening. Mitral valve area is 0.8 square centimeter with a mean diastolic transvalvular gradient is 23 millimeter of mercury, and there is also grade 3 mitral regurgitation. And in tricuspid valve, there is moderate tricuspid regurgitations, but the aortic valve is normal, and pulmonary valve is normal, but pulmonary artery systolic pressure is 60 millimeter of mercury. And regarding IVC, it is 16 millimeter in the maximum diameter, and there is respiratory variation is present.
So, can we go one point by point?
Yes,
normal size LV cavity. Ejection fraction is 60%. What do you mean by ejection fraction?
It is the basically it can be calculated by the difference between the end diastolic and end-systolic volume divided by the end diastolic volume as a percentage, and it is the fractions of the blood that is ejected per cardiac cycle, that each beat of the cardiac cycle that can be calculated in that way.
What is the normal ejection fraction?
Normal ejection fraction is 50 to 70%.
50 to 70%. RV function is normal and TAPSE. What do you mean by TAPSE?
TAPSE is a transannular plane systolic excursion, and if the TAPSE value is less than 17,
Transannular. Oh, so say that again. What is the transannular plane?
systolic excursion.
Is it transannular or
Tricuspid annular plane systolic excursion.
It is tricuspid annular plane systolic excursion. How do you measure it?
Sir, it ideally it should be measured in the thoracic echocardiography, and
Transthoracic, okay.
It is.
Why do you say that you cannot measure in transesophageal echocardiography?
Yes, sir. Yeah, it can be measured in the transesophageal because there is a problem in the alignment of the beam with the lateral tricuspid annulus. So that is ideally it should be recommended to measure in the transthoracic, but it can be measured in the transesophageal also.
Okay, I'll take that answer. How do you measure it?
Sir, the pulse wave Doppler beam is aligned with the left annulus of the lateral annulus of the tricuspid valve, and we measure the velocity and the tricuspid valve velocity, and from there we can measure the TAPSE, basically the movement of the longitudinal movement of the right ventricle.
Longitudinal movement of the right ventricle. It's not clear. Not clear how what you said. What does it indicate?
Sir, if the TAPSE value is less than 17, it indicates the RV dysfunction. Dysfunction.
What is the normal value?
The normal value is 18 to 25.
What is the unit of measurement? Is centimeter,
millimeter,
or what? Millimeter. You have mentioned millimeter. That's good. What are the other parameters for right ventricular systolic function? One is
another is the TI index, which is the myocardial performance index. This is a IVRT and IVCT by divided by ejection time. And another is the.
Right. What is the value on the left side and what is the value on the right side? Normal values.
Yes, sir. For right side it is 0.7 and left side it is 0.8.
Left side it is 0.7, no?
0.7.
And right side is 0.8. Does everybody agree with that?
No, sir.
Sir, for right side it will be 0.43 and for left side it will be around 0.54.
No, 5 is also high, sir. 0.34 plus or minus 5, sir, for the left side. It's always in the range from 0.3 to 0.4. Beyond that, we say it's a dysfunction starts, sir.
Yeah, easy to remember. Right side 0.3, left side is 0.4.
Yes, sir.
0.3 for right, 0.4 for left. And if it is high, it means that there is a dysfunction which is combined systolic and diastolic dysfunction. Okay, what is FAC?
Sorry, sir.
What is FAC?
Fractional area shortening. Fractional area changes. Fractional area changes.
Okay. Can it be used for right ventricular function?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It can.
What is the normal right ventricular ejection fraction?
It is 30 to 50%, sir. Mean of 40.
Why it's like that? Left side it is 50 to 70. You said right side it is less.
Because the right ventricular wall is less thicker than the left ventricular function. It's a thin wall structure, and it is also against the low. The right ventricular ejection is against the pulmonary circulation. It is a low resistance circulation rather than the systemic circulation, which is pumped against the left ventricle pumped against the systemic high resistance circulation. So it is the two main causes and the whole of the RV is also not contributing in the ejection fraction movement of the RV. Particularly the septal wall is not movement. It's also the volume dependent most of the time in cases of the RV. So the ejection fraction is lower in right side than the left side. Normal ejection fraction is lower.
See, the main reason is that the right ventricular end-diastolic volume is somewhat greater as compared to left ventricular end-diastolic volume.
Okay, sir.
So proportionately, it has to pump less to get the same stroke volume. Stroke volume on both sides are equal, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Yes.
If it is 70 ml this side, it is 70 ml that side also normally. So the left ventricular end-diastolic volume then compared to right ventricle is less, little less. So right ventricle need not have to pump so strongly to be able to generate the same volume because it's little more full.
Yes, sir.
That's the reason why the ejection fraction on the right side is about 45, whereas in the left side it's about 55 average, I'm saying.
Yes, sir.
Okay, now coming to the mitral valve, can you describe the mitral valve, normal mitral valve?
Yes, sir.
Just describe the normal mitral valve.
I mean, sir, anatomy of the mitral valve.
Yeah, describe the
Yes,
normal anatomy of the mitral valve.
Yes,
From 5 to 10 sentences.
Mitral valve anatomy can be described as a mitral annulus, mitral valve leaflet, chordae tendineae, and the papillary muscles,
Yes.
and LV wall complex. So,
Yes.
so mitral annulus, annulus is a fibrous structure, and it can be consist of the fibrous ring in continuity with other valves in the base of the heart. And the leaflet, there are anterior mitral leaflet and posterior mitral leaflet are there, and
yes,
and the anterior mitral leaflet is bigger than the posterior mitral leaflet. And regarding annulus, there is one point I missed. There is a posteriorly there is a weak portion. There is a deficient in the mitral annulus in the posterior portion. So the prolapse is more common in the posterior portions of the mitral valve. And regarding the papillary, papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae, there are 3 order of chordae tendineae which attaches from the papillary muscle to the mitral valve leaflet. The first order chordae is from the papillary muscle to the tip of the chordae. Second order chordae is the papillary muscle to the body and the base of the mitral valve leaflet. And the third order chordae, it is only for the PML from the free wall of the papillary from the left ventricle to the mitral leaflet. And
what are the indentations on the valves? Is there any indentations?
It is a basically saddle shaped valve, and it's a dynamic valve, and its position varies with systole and diastole. In diastole, it is more circular, and in systole, it is a saddle shaped valve.
Yeah, correct. So, which is the longer long axis and short axis? Where do you see the long axis and short axis of the mitral valve?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
In which TE view you will get long axis and short axis of the mitral valve?
In which T view? Okay, sir.
Yeah.
In mediasophageal 4-chamber view, you can see the long axis of the mitral valve, and mitral commissural view, you can see the mitral commissural and the aortic valve, mediasophageal aortic valve long axis view. You can see the short axis of the mitral valve.
Does anybody agree or disagree with this?
Sir, for the long axis, the view is mediasophageal mitral commissural view, and for short axis, it is the mediasophageal aortic valve long axis view.
Correct. That is correct. You get the long axis of the mitral valve in the commissural view and short axis in the
mediasophageal aortic valve long axis view.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay. Then mitral valve area. What is the normal mitral valve area?
It is a 4 to 6 square centimeter.
And this is a 0.8 square centimeter. What does that mean?
This is a severe mitral stenosis.
Severe mitral stenosis. That's correct. And how do you grade mitral stenosis?
Mitral stenosis can be graded according to the mitral area, valve area, and the pressure gradient between the mitral pressure gradient and the pulmonary artery systole, pulmonary artery, mean pulmonary artery pressures.
Mean pulmonary artery pressures. Okay. So this one is 0.8. So can you tell me how to grade the mitral stenosis depending on the area?
Yes, sir. Area. Yes, sir. If it is 1.5 to 2.5 square centimeter, it is mild. If it is between 1 to 1.5, it is moderate.
1.5, yes.
If it is less than 1 square centimeter, it is severe.
Good. Well, depending on the gradient, how do you do that?
Yes, gradient is normal gradient is 0 to 5. It is less than 5, then it is mild. 5 to 10, it is moderate, and more than 10, it is severe.
Yeah, that's good. And how do you grade MR? They say grade MR here. How do you grade MR?
Yes, MR can be graded through different parameters in echo. There are some quantitative parameters and the semi-quantitative parameters and semi-quantitative parameters. In quantitative parameter, there is effective regurgitant orifice, effective regurgitant volume, and effective regurgitant fraction. These are for the grading of the MR. And semi-quantitative parameter, there is a vena contracta to grading of the MR. And qualitative parameter, we can grade the MR according to the regurgitant fraction. I mean, in cases of severe MR, there is a flow convergence around the mitral valve, and it's a central jet, and if it is central jet and wall hugging jet, that converts to the more than two-third area of the LA, that is considered as a severe MR. And in vena contracta, if it is more than 0.7 millimeter, 0.7 centimeter, then it is called it as severe MR.
How do you define vena contracta?
In mid-esophageal 4-chamber view, in color Doppler studies, there is a first identify the MR from the L2 to LA, and the narrowest portions of the color Doppler jet, we can measure the narrowest portion of the color Doppler jet, and that is regarded as a vena contracta.
Okay. What is other information which is vital, which is missing in this report? Echocardiography.
Yes, sir.
Other information which is probably important, which is actually important, which is missing from this report.
It is said that the LA size and the pulmonary artery systolic pressure, RV function, and the LA thrombus. If there is LA size.
LA thrombus is missing in the report, which is important.
Sir, no LA thrombus is written, sir. In LA.
Where is it written? It's written, is it? Oh, yeah, it's written. Sorry, I didn't miss it. So there is no LA thrombus. Okay, now we'll go to the next one. What is the next one you have? Next slide.
Next slide. Sir, probably me.
Sorry?
Sir, probably me, Dr. Soumitra.
Tell me now.
Sir, it's probably me, Dr. Soumitra.
So next slide is it is a summary of the case.
Okay. Sorry.
So these are the investigation portions, and next we made a summary of the case.
Okay. So she is scheduled for mitral valve replacement. So this lady is on furosemide, digoxin, and metoprolol.
Yes,
can
sir.
you explain to me, Soumitra, can you tell me why the patient is getting furosemide, digoxin, and metoprolol?
Sir, furosemide has been given to control the heart failure as a management of heart failure plan. And digoxin and metoprolol has been given to control the fast ventricular rate in a setting of atrial fibrillation.
Very good. How does digoxin act?
Sir, digoxin is an oral inotropic agent. It acts by binding with the sodium potassium ATPase channel, and after binding with that channel, the intracellular calcium concentration is increased. That's why myocardial contractility is also increased. By this way, it increases the myocardial contractility. At the same time, it reduces at the same time it increases the refractory period from the SA node to the AV node. By increasing the AV refractory period, it reduces the heart rate.
That is right. That's right. And what group of cardiac drug is digoxin?
Sir, what group of drug? It is a cardiac glycoside.
It's a cardiac glycoside. And it causes inhibition of sodium ATPase.
Yes.
It causes inhibition of the sodium ATPase. Thereby sodium, and then this sodium is exchanged for calcium. So
so that intracellular calcium is increased.
So if I say that this patient is getting digitoxicity, if I tell you that patient is in digitoxicity, what will be the signs of digitoxicity in a given patient?
Sir, clinically, patient might be disoriented. There will be disoriented state, defect in intellectual function, and then if we measure the serum digoxin concentration, it will be on the higher side. And then if we do the ECG, there will be variant arrhythmia, which is a manifestation of the digoxin toxicity.
Yeah, that's true. They usually have nausea and vomiting.
Yeah, nausea vomiting is also there.
Nausea vomiting will be there. And what is the therapeutic range of digoxin levels?
Sir, I forgot, but probably it will be 0.8 to 1.2 nanogram per ml. Sir, I forgot, sir.
Prachi, can you tell me what is the therapeutic levels of serum digoxin?
I think 0.8 to 1.2 nanograms per ml, sir.
Okay, that's correct. So there is a narrow therapeutic ratio. The beyond 3 and all the patients will get digoxin toxicity. And how do you treat it?
Sir, first of all, treatment of the electrolyte imbalance, that is hypokalemia and hypomagnesemia, they potentiate the digoxin toxicity. So correction of the dyselectrolytemia, number one. Number two, if there is life-threatening arrhythmia, then cardioversion should be done, and oral or intravenous treatment of the existing arrhythmia. And lastly, then DG bind, that is the FAB, which is an antagonist of the digoxin, can be given. And if all these measures fail, then hemodialysis is applicable.
That's right. Okay, what is the half-life of digoxin?
Sir, 4 to 5 days.
4 to 5 days? No, it's too long. It is 36 hours.
Okay, sir. Okay.
It's about approximately 1.5 hours. Half-life is about 36 hours. And do you continue digoxin till the day of surgery, or what's your policy?
Sir, digoxin should be continued on the day of surgery.
On the day of surgery. Sir. Why do you want to continue?
Sir, because
arrhythmia.
Because patient is already prone to have arrhythmia, and in the perioperative period there will be lot of fluid shift and there will be lot of dyselectrolytemic state. So that can also aggravate the arrhythmia. So it is preferred to continue the digoxin in the day of surgery.
What is the policy in your institution? Do you give digoxin on the day of surgery? Morning, yes, sir, do you ask for morning dose of digoxin to be given?
Sir, we do give digoxin on the day of surgery.
Yeah, in theory it is correct. In theory, it is better to give digoxin, especially in such a case with atrial fibrillation with heart rate of 110 and history of cardiac failure. It's theory you can give. It is advisable to give digoxin and monitor the potassium a little more rigorously during the surgical procedure.
Yes, sir.
But in practice, they don't give nil. They are nil or lit. They don't give anything here. I don't know why. So that is what is happening here. But in theory, what you say is right. I agree with that. Now we'll go on to metoprolol. What is metoprolol?
Sir, metoprolol is a cardioselective beta blocker.
Cardioselective beta blocker. Why is it being
Sir,
given?
it is
for
being
this
given
patient?
because to reduce the fast ventricular rate in atrial fibrillation.
Very good. Now we'll go to the preoperative preparation. The Satyajit, can you come onto the screen and tell me how you're going to prepare this patient?
Yes, sir. Sir, during
Tell me
pre-op,
how do you prepare this patient?
first I have to.
Now you have you have got the X-ray, ECG, echocardiography. Are you going to do angiography for this case?
This patient is 33 years old. As per institution protocol, more than 40 years of age, we usually do the angiography. So,
Okay.
in this patient, usually do not we do the angiography.
Okay.
So this is
preoperative preparation. And I just want, before that, I want to know the ejection fraction is how much you said? 50% or 60%?
60%, sir.
60%.
Sorry, sir.
Is it good?
Sir, in the setting of MR, in MS and MR, though there is a LV pop-up in cases of low resistance in the for ejection fraction. There is a low resistance in the LA side. So 60% ejection fraction is maybe erroneous for that patient. So we should consider below 60%. If this ejection fraction is below 60%, we should consider it is a poor LV function, because in the setting of MR, 60%, 50% is not good, but 60% we can accept as a good ejection fractions.
Actually, what is the mechanism of MR in rheumatic heart disease?
Sir, mechanism of MR. Basically, this is the positive organism is the streptococcal beta group A beta hemolytic.
No. Mechanism is there are Carpenter has classified into 3 mechanisms. One is the normal leaf motion. Second is
excessive leaflet motions.
So
systole. There is a 3 class.
Rheumatic heart disease. So which sort of mechanism? Sorry.
In rheumatic heart disease, it is 2B. In rheumatic heart disease,
2B is it?
Yes, sir.
2A.
Ashutosh Sahu, can you tell me what is the mechanism of MR? 2A. What is 2A and what is 2B?
So we have 3A, 3B.
Sir, there is no, I think,
There
is no
2A.
Sorry.
And rheumatic fever causing mitral regurgitation is 3A.
3B.
It is
3A, sir. 3A.
It is 3A.
3B?
3B is the ischemic
It's-
cardiomyopathy causing mitral regurgitation.
3A.
3A is both systolic and diastolic.
Can you tell me
Yes.
how do you categorize the mitral?
Hello, sir.
Stephen, can you tell me how do you classify the mechanism of MR?
Yes, sir. According to Carpenter's classification, the mitral regurgitation is divided into grade 1, 2, and 3. In Carpenter class 1, it is due to the normal leaf. There will be normal leaflet motion. Usually, it happens in annular dilatation, or there is mostly annular dilatation. And in Carpentier class 2, it is due to excessive motion of the leaflets, like as in prolapsed leaflet and plial leaflets. And in Carpentier classification
Okay.
3, in 3A, it is mainly of rheumatic origin. It is due to restricted motion of the leaflets. And in 3B, it is in ischemic heart disease. It is seen in ischemic heart disease. It is seen in mostly in systole.
So 3A
Yeah,
is restricted motion in the diastole and 3B is restricted motion in the systole.
No, sir. So 3A
No,
is
sir.
Sorry, say that
diastole.
again.
In
Say that again.
in class 3A, it is like due to rheumatic origin. So it is the leaflet motion is restricted both in systole and diastole, but in class 2B, it is restricted in
Correct.
systole. Yeah.
Restricted in
Systole in class 2B. Sorry, 3B.
systole alone. Systole.
Yes, sir.
It is usually because of ischemic heart disease. So class 1 is normal leaflet motion because of annular dilatation or perforation.
Yes, sir.
Or
Yes.
cleft in the mitral leaflet. The valve motion is normal, but because of the annular dilatation, cleft or perforation, there is regurgitation.
Yes.
And this in mitral stenosis, this case it will be type 3, where
Yes.
there is a restriction of the mitral valve leaflet motion both in systole and diastole.
Yes, sir.
So that is it. And now we'll go to the pre-op preparation we will doing. Ashutosh, can you tell me what are the things which you look into the pre-op preparation?
Sir,
You said about digoxin. Digoxin will be continued till the time of surgery. Metoprolol will be given. How about furosemide? What will you do with furosemide?
Sir, we will continue furosemide, but we will check the potassium level, whether it's to maintain proper potassium level. If there is hypokalemia or not.
Right, right. So what are the guidelines which say about furosemide should be continued or not?
The furosemide should be continued till the day of surgery, and on the
No, do we give a dose in the morning or?
in our institution we
What
give
are the advantages
furosemide
of
in the
giving
morning.
it? What is the advantage of not giving?
Sir, the patient is in failure, so
No, tell me what are the advantages?
Sir, the patient is in failure, so if we are giving furosemide, then the congestive symptoms will be less, and and if we are giving then
the advantage of giving is that patient's chest will be clear when the patient arrives to the theater, but there may be incidence of hypokalemia and contracted volume status. If you do not give, patient may have wet lungs when the patient arrives to the theater, especially if the heart rate goes up because of preoperative anxiety, etc. So there is no firm guidelines for the use of furosemide preoperatively and before surgery. But practically what we can do is when we examine the patient night before or just before taking the patient inside, you have to auscultate the chest and see if the chest is absolutely clear or if there are some crackles. If there are some crackles, so you give 10 milligrams just after the patient is inside the theater. Otherwise, you don't have to do anything. Just take the patient and do the case. So this is in between policy. And then we'll go on to the pre-medication. Stephen, will you give pre-medication to this patient?
We'll give pre-medication midazolam.
Midazolam, when do you give previous night or?
In previous night, we had given alprazolam 0.5 milligram per kg per 0.5 milligram, and in the midazolam we give in the preoperative area.
Preoperative area. Others, Ashutosh, what will you do? You will give pre-medication, sedative pre-medication?
Sir, since the patient is a case of mitral stenosis and we have to prevent any kind of anxiety and tachycardia, so adequate amount of pre-medication is necessary to avoid tachycardia.
Okay. Soumitra, what will you do? You'll give pre-medication. What is your policy in your hospital?
Sir, in our hospital policy, what we used to do is that we continue the relevant drugs in the preoperative period. Regarding the sedative pre-medication, we use low dose benzodiazepine in the day before at the night, the day before surgery, to reduce the anxiety related tachycardia, and on the day of surgery, in the preoperative holding area, if required, if we see that patient is still having some kind of anxiety and tachycardia, then we use low dose of midazolam in the preoperative holding area with a background of oxygen support and with continuous monitoring of the saturation as well as the censoring of the patient, because too much sedation will cause decreased drive of the respiration and causing the increase in pulmonary pressure. So we have to balance between the reduction of anxiety, at the same time not to cut down the sympathetic drive and to increase the pulmonary pressure.
Yeah. So, whatever you have said is quite reasonable. But what we can do is that we can establish a good psychological rapport with the patient previous day, and also just guess or assess the level of anxiety in the patient. If the patient looks anxious, and also you can ask a leading question whether she can sleep well at night without any sedative medication. Then this patient has a history of congestive heart failure, so you have to consider that also into account. So some of the patients may say that I am fine, I don't want any sedative pre-medication, I have already had one surgery. On the other hand, there may be patients who may say that I already had surgery, I am feeling anxious. So you have to assess the level of anxiety, and also find out whether the patient is comfortable sleeping without any sedative medication. So based on this, you can give sedation or don't give anything. You don't have to give anything if the patient is comfortable and says that she can sleep without any problem. So after that, we'll go on to the anesthetic induction. Now that we are running in the COVID era, what will you do with COVID testing? What is the COVID policy? Stephen, can you tell me?
So in our institution, we will do COVID testing for patient at like the latest
COVID
report
testing
will be.
which testing you will do? You will do rapid test or RT-PCR? Or
We are doing RT-PCR, sir. And we'll
RT-PCR. What will be if it comes negative, and what will be if it comes positive?
So whether it is coming negative or positive, we will take all. Yes, sir. So we will whether it is positive or
relatively elective case.
So positive, we don't do the case, sir. So like positive cases, usually we'll refer to the. Hello, sir.
Anybody can answer this. What will you do if it is?
Sir, in our institution, yeah, we have the COVID ward and non-COVID ward. We do the COVID test RT-PCR within the 3 days of the admission of the hospital. If it is negative, we go for the surgery. But the day before surgery, we do a TrueNAT test.
Negative, you're going to operate.
If it is negative, then in the day before surgery, we do another COVID test for the TrueNAT, which the report is come within the 24 hour, within 12 to 24 hours. And if it is also negative, then we proceed for the surgery. And if it is positive, then we, as it is an elective case, we defer the surgery and shift the patient to the COVID area and treated accordingly. And when the patient is negative, then we come back for the surgery.
The recommendation is if the patient is positive, you defer the surgery for 14 days.
Yes, sir.
You should not be operating because the risk is 20% mortality is there even in non-cardiac patients. If the patient is positive and you did this non-cardiac surgery, 20% of the patients will die. I'm talking about non-cardiac. So in cardiac, the mortality will be much higher. So if the patient is positive, you do not do the surgery. You defer this unless it is emergency. This is not really that emergency. So unless it is emergency, you don't do the case. And you ask the patient wait for 14 days and then repeat the RT-PCR. And if it is negative, you do one more RT-PCR after 48 hours. And in the meantime, also do HRCT. And if it is less than 2 grade, then you can take the patient. Okay. If the patient is positive, we cannot operate elective cardiac surgery. There's no point
Yes.
because the mortality rate is very high. Patient will die of hypoxemia and lung complications. You may do a successful surgery, but patient is going to die. 50% of them will die.
Yes.
Now coming to the monitoring, the patient is taken inside and monitoring. Tell me what monitors will you use? Satyajit, you tell me. Patient is
Yes,
inside the theater. What monitoring? So to start, how will you start the case?
Yes, sir. Inside the monitor, we first check the identity of the patient, and then we attach the pulse oximetry.
Is
and
Rahul there? Rahul, are you there?
Yes, sir. I am here.
Do you agree with this COVID policy? If it is
Sir.
positive, we cannot do any elective case. And wait for 14 days, do the RT-PCR. If it is negative, do once more. And also do the HRCT and then only take the patient.
Yes, sir. Agreed, sir. That is the policy.
This is okay.
This is okay.
Yeah. This is what we have been, the recommendations. I mean, so a sort of recommend. This is not a evidence-based recommendation, but it is opinion-based recommendation.
Absolutely, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So the patient is come to the theater. Now we are going to check everything. Next.
Yes, sir. After confirming the identity of the patient, we attach the monitor regarding the ASA standard monitoring protocol. We attach the pulse oximetry and ECG and non-invasive blood pressure and attach the oxygen through via nasal cannula also. Then we go for the invasive monitoring like arterial blood pressure monitoring, preferably the femoral arterial blood pressure monitoring, and the central venous pressure monitoring, and the triple lumen catheter in the internal jugular vein.
Do you put the triple lumen when the patient is conscious or after induction you are going to put?
In our institution protocol under local anesthesia, we put the triple lumen before induction of anesthesia.
Okay. Is there any problem in putting triple lumen in this case?
Yes, this is a redo surgery. Previously, there may be, though it is a long time before, 11 years before the surgery was there, but there should not be any problem for these cases. But
there should not be any problem. Prachi, do you think there will be any problem in putting central line when the patient is conscious in this case?
Sir, again, pain is, we have to take adequate precautions that the patient does not have any pain sympathetic stimulation, as a result of which, again, the patient can have a high risk of going into arrhythmias and decompensating on table also. So that is the reason he should be given adequate local anesthesia, and then we should be giving the inserting the triple lumen central line, sir.
Okay, Ashutosh, any idea on this? I want to put a central venous catheter in a patient, this patient, before anesthesia. Is there any concern in this patient?
The main concern is tachycardia, which may aggravate the low cardiac output and congestion in the patient, pulmonary congestion. So we can give adequate amount of local anesthetic agent before inserting, or we can insert the CVP after induction of the patient.
Another thing, sir.
So one more,
What is the other thing?
So another thing, patient having said.
Yeah.
So in our institution, in such cases where we anticipate catastrophe during induction, we do internal jugular cannulation under local anesthesia. But in this patient, because patient is already having atrial fibrillation and this central line guide wire can stimulate and can cause further arrhythmia. So we take precautions not to cause that, not to aggravate the arrhythmias by inserting the catheter too much. We'll take precautions and we'll do under adequate local anesthesia.
This is who is speaking, Stephen.
Yes, sir.
Another thing would be the ability to lie flat, sir, for these patients. Will they be able to tolerate a supine position?
Yeah, you're coming closer to what I wanted to know. See, in this patient who has a history of paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea, if you put a Trendelenburg, they may become acutely dyspneic. You have to keep this in mind and probably avoid Trendelenburg in this patient when you're putting CVP line. Yes. Normally, if you're doing it conscious, patient may develop dyspnea during if you're putting the patient in Trendelenburg position. So this you have to keep in mind, yes, and then do it. But my policy is to do the CERMLINE after anesthetic induction. But if you want to do it before induction, there's absolutely no problem. But you have to keep this in mind. Yes. With Trendelenburg, there may be pulmonary condition. So either you keep it in mind and do it, or you avoid Trendelenburg. That is up to you. But yes, if you're doing conscious CVP line, the risk of air embolism is there. So Trendelenburg is usually advocated. Now you put the femoral arterial line. Why do you want femoral arterial line?
Because arterial blood pressure monitoring is important, and this is a redo surgery in a prolonged. There may be the prolonged pump time. So instead of radial arterial line, femoral arterial line will be much better after the pump, post-pump period.
That is true. That is true. But when you're putting a femoral arterial line in this case, you must discuss it with surgeon because he might want to write.
Yes, yes. Peripheral
yes, yes. So if he wants to have a femoral access in case of catastrophe, we have to tell, we have to discuss it out whether which side he would prefer to go put a femoral arterial cannula in case of emergency for bypass purposes. So you go to the other side. And femoral arterial cannula, you can argue that it is useful because you get the central aortic pressure more reliably with femoral arterial cannula. And when you're coming out bypass, it is going to help you to come out bypass more easily than with radial arterial cannula. That's why you want to have a femoral arterial cannula. But if the infection control team says about femoral lines, it will cause more infection. What will you say?
Yes, sir. Regarding infection,
because infection control people, they will say that femoral lines, I'm talking femoral lines, cause more infection. Don't put femoral lines.
Yes, this is true, sir. Femoral line causes more infection. So in that situation, we can consider for the radial line also.
You're putting both, is it? You're putting both. Then how are you avoiding femoral infection? You femoral line also, you're putting radial artery also.
Sir, after first POD or after shifting the patient to the ICU, if the patient is chronic condition is more or less stable, then we can remove the femoral line and we can continue.
Very good. That is one option here. That is one option here. And also, see, this is a bit of argumentative. You can argue it is argumentative. There is evidence to show that femoral arterial lines do not cause as much infection as it is thought to be. And it is the femoral venous line which is causing more infection than the arterial line, because we do not inject anything into the artery. We just take blood samples. Other than that, we don't inject anything into the artery. So, and the arterial pressure is higher, so infection doesn't usually go into the arterial system. Whereas venous line, you are giving drugs and other things, so the chance of infection is more. But this is argumentative. So you can always say that I will remove the line after the surgery and put a radial line, or simultaneously put a radial line and then remove the femoral line once the patient is stable in the ICU. Next question will go to what other parameters you will monitor in this case. You have arterial line. Will you put a PA catheter?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. In our institute, routinely we do not PA catheter, do not put the PA catheter for
You will
this
put a
type
PA
of.
catheter. Okay, and you will use a transesophageal echocardiography.
Yes, sir. Transesophageal echocardiography should be done in these cases, but regarding the situation of
okay,
COVID.
now tell me the induction protocol. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sir,
Tell
induction.
me the induction anesthetic.
Yes, sir. After putting all the invasive monitoring line and we put to start the induction. Induction can be done with the cardiostable induction agent like etomidate and also the volatile anesthetic agent. Hello, sir.
Which volatile anesthetic agent?
Sir, in our institution, we uses the sevoflurane.
No, you are inducing with etomidate as well as sevoflurane.
Yes, sir.
That's what you want to say?
No, sir. Either etomidate or etomidate, either etomidate or induction agent with the sevoflurane. In our institution, we do not use etomidate regularly. We uses the in routinely we uses the sevoflurane induction, and then we after checking the adequacy of the induction, we put the muscle relaxation, particularly vicuronium, and keeping in mind the pancuronium may causes tachycardia in this patient, so uses the vicuronium. After adequate checking the ventilation, we put the endotracheal intubation. We have done endotracheal intubations and securing the tube and going for proceeding for further.
So, what are the precautions you are going to take because this is a redo case?
Yes, sir.
So, what are the additional steps you take?
Sir. Before doing induction, we should attach the external defibrillator pedal.
Okay, very good.
And the perfusion team and the pump should be ready, and the pump should be primed, and all the perfusionist, cardiac surgeon, scrub nurse should be ready for any emergency, and blood. We should availability of the blood in the theater. Usually, we 2 units of blood will be available within the theater, and also check for the peripheral cannulation site. I discussed with the surgeon for the emergency bypass for the peripheral cannulation site. They also prepare for the peripheral cannulation site before doing the induction for these cases.
Stephen, can you tell me what the surgeon will request you when he's doing sternotomy? And how do you oblige to that request?
So during sternotomy, the surgeon will ask us not to ventilate the patient for the duration of the sternotomy. But in this case, usually they'll use oscillatory saw. So it
anything else they will ask? In my center, they usually ask you to reduce the blood pressure to about 80 to 70 to 60.
Yes, sir.
They usually, because the heart will be less tense and the chance of opening the right atrium, right ventricle will be less if the heart is little soft.
Yes, sir.
So they may request you to reduce the blood pressure. That you have to do carefully. Usually increasing the isoflurane concentration will do the trick. You don't have to do any additional agents.
Yes, sir.
Give additional agents. So normally they do ask us to reduce the blood pressure.
Yes,
once the sternotomy is done, reduced sternotomy is done, you have to bring back the blood pressure to the usual values. You cannot keep it hypotensive for a very long time.
Yes, sir.
And what are the problems during resternotomy?
So during resternotomy, the structure underneath can be damaged, and that we can expect a massive bleeding, and the patient hemorrhagic arrest can happen. So like
correct.
So like if we expect this, like ideal would be like have a peripheral access, like in the form of like peripheral bypass, femoral bypass, establish a femoral bypass before, or sometimes we just put a guide wire and keep, so in case of emergency we can easily pass the catheter and establish a peripheral bypass.
Usually guide wire is not passed, but the femoral artery is exposed and kept ready, taped and ready.
Yes,
and in case of this thing, within 5 minutes you can put the cannula and go on bypass. Before that, you have to give the heparinization and then carry on. The femoral site is exposed. If the risk of sternotomy is high, so that's why you have to look at the distance between the backside of the sternum and the heart during the lateral X-ray and decide about the risk of the sternotomy. If it is high risk, you should preferably keep the femoral site open, cut open and ready.
Yes, sir.
There's no guide wire put there, but it's kept ready so that it's looped and kept ready. You can go inside, go to bypass immediately. Now, after the sternotomy, what is the heparin? How much heparin do you give?
So we give in our institution we give 4 milligram per kilogram. Sir.
400 units.
400 units per
400 units. How does heparin act?
Heparin, like it potentiates the action of antithrombin 3 over several 10 over 1000-fold. So
yes,
that
yes, correct.
Yes.
Basic action is enhancement of activity of antithrombin 3. It also has 10A anti-10A activity, but major action is increase in the antithrombin 3 activity. Okay, tell me something about perfusion. In this case, what are the parameters you will monitor and what are the normal ranges? What mean arterial pressure you will maintain during perfusion?
The mean arterial pressure in this case, I'll keep always above 60 mean arterial pressure. So I will not allow. In this, the patient preoperative BP was only 90/60 BP. So I will try to manage a BP in that range. I will not allow a drastic drop in the blood pressure from the baseline.
What cardioplegia are you going to do?
So we use the Del-Nido cardioplegia in our institution.
Is it antegrade or retrograde?
So usually, like I have never seen a retrograde plegia. Like most of the time we will give antegrade cardioplegia.
Antegrade cardioplegia. What is the temperature of the cardioplegia? What temperature you give?
The temperature be around. I forgot. It's around 12 degrees. I'm not sure.
Who's answering this question?
Stephen, 3 degrees, sir.
2 to 8 degrees Celsius.
Yes, sir.
We give around 3.
Yes, sir.
3 degrees?
Celsius.
Sir, 2 to 8 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, 4 to 8 degrees, that's fine. And why do you have to give cold cardioplegia? Is it sanguineous cardioplegia or crystalloid cardioplegia?
I'm sorry, sir.
Is it blood cardioplegia or crystalloid cardioplegia?
It's a crystalloid cardioplegia.
You mix blood, is it? 1:4 blood.
Yes, sir. Yeah, blood will be mixed with that. Yeah.
So is it crystalloid or blood cardioplegia?
It is crystalloid cardioplegia and it is mixed with blood. So I'm not sure.
If it is mixed with blood, it is blood cardioplegia. No?
Okay.
It's mixed with blood means it's blood cardioplegia. So what is the advantage of blood cardioplegia?
So blood cardioplegia, it will have substrates like for myocardial preservation, like it can supply the substrates like ATP, and that will give more better myocardial preservation.
It carries oxygen.
Oxygen, yeah.
It carries oxygen, and it also reduces the tissue edema, because it is, if it is crystalloid cardioplegia, it has low oncotic pressure, whereas blood cardioplegia will have some reasonable oncotic pressure. So the tissue edema is not as much as with crystalloid cardioplegia.
Yes, sir.
What is the hematocrit you will maintain in the perfusate?
Hematocrit around 20%, sir.
20 to 25%.
20, yes.
20 to 25%. If it comes below 20,
Hello,
what will you do? If it comes below 20, what is the strategy?
So we'll transfuse blood in the pumps, like we'll add blood.
You can add blood, okay, or you can give some fruits, whichever is suitable there. Now, do you do this ultrafiltration for this case? Modified conventional ultrafiltration, what they call as cuff.
Sorry,
Satyajit, can you tell me, will you do cuff in this case?
Yes, sir.
Hello. Hello. Sir, I couldn't hear you.
Sir, could not hear you,
Satyajit, will you do conventional ultrafiltration for this case?
Yes, sir. This case, we should continue the continuous ultrafiltration.
Why you want to do it?
Because this patient has a regurgitant lesion, mitral regurgitation and tricuspid volume overload, and continuous ultrafiltration will help in the postoperative period to reduces the volume as well as the buildup of the hematocrit, and the hemodynamic parameter will be better if we do the continuous ultrafiltrations for this patient. And patient is also in the preoperative in congestive cardiac failure, so it will help, sir. It will help, sir.
What is RAP? That is retrograde auto priming, autologous priming.
Sorry, sir. I can forget, sir.
It is a method of blood conservation, sir.
Yes. It can be used for blood for priming of the CV bypass circuit. The method is after the
amount of tell me.
So the method is after the aortic cannulation, patient is placed in a slight Trendelenburg position, and then with controlled pressure, blood is sucked from the aorta within the CV bypass circuit, maintaining the hemodynamic stable. And in this way, the blood is added with the CV bypass circuit, so that autologous blood transfusion risk is reduced.
Correct. It is also reduce the amount of crystalloids put in the prime, so that the hemodilution to some extent is reduced. And will you give antifibrinolytics in this case before going on bypass?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Which one will you give? Prachi, which one will you give?
So in our institute, we use tranexamic acid, sir, 30 milligrams per kg as a bolus dose.
How much?
We give tranexamic acid 30 milligrams per kg. Hello.
30 milligrams per kg. Do you give continuous infusion as well?
So we do. It has been recommended, but we don't give it as a continuous infusion, sir.
Okay.
In our institute, sir.
Okay. Now we'll go on to the post-bypass period. How do you come off bypass in this case? So this is who will answer this? Satyajit, coming off bypass, can you tell me?
Yes, sir. After the completion of the surgery, we at the end of the CV bypass we infuse the reperfusion. This is the hot shot. After giving the hot shot, we see if there is any it will read after giving hot shot, we expect some myocardial activity, and at the same time we check all the parameters of the blood, ABG, and the hemodynamic and the activity in the ECG. And we also start the inotropic agent like epinephrine and dobutamine in our institution, and we look for the activity of the heart, and also check all the parameter. We correct the acidosis, potassium level, potassium level of the blood, hematocrit of the patient. We should check, and if required, if pacing, we start the pacing is indicated. So pacing, you can start the pacing. Maybe according to the activity, we can start the DDD pacing or atrial pacing or ventricular pacing, and we slowly reduces the pump flow from the 50% then 20%, and slowly coming off bypass when the hemodynamics is stable, mean arterial pressure is more than above 60 and the CVP is around 5 to 10, between 5 to 10. We can reduces the pump flow, and we come off the bypass sequentially according to the condition.
So what is the choice of, what is the protocol you follow when you come back? Do you have any checklist like that? Do you have a checklist which will look into that and then come off?
Yes, sir.
What are the components of that?
Yes, sir. And routinely we follow the CVS checklist. That is a synonym, but we follow this parameter. I exactly don't remember all the components. We just checking all these
stepwise. One is blood gases, potassium, hematocrit, temperature, ventilation, on concentrating, bleeding point check, monitor, recalibrated, pleural space emptied, inotropes available and kept ready.
Yes, sir.
All these things should be followed step by
sequentially.
Yes, sequentially. And then what is the role of inodilators in this case?
Yes, this patient having pulmonary hypertension and also the regurgitant lesions in the like MR. So milrinone can help in the.
What is milrinone?
It's a inodilator, and it's a phosphodiesterase 2 inhibitor.
Yeah, phosphodiesterase 3 inhibitor. How do you evaluate valvular function by ET?
This post bypass, we have to check the mean gradient, and we have to replace the mitral valve. We have to check the mean and mean gradient and peak gradient, and if there is any regurgitant jet or there is any other there is a LV functions and the RV function, and there is a gradient across the mitral valve and the regurgitant jet of the mitral valve. There is a paravalvular leak.
Yeah, first you have to see the morphology of the valve, whether the valve leaflets are moving well or not. First thing is to check the morphology of the valve.
Yes.
First thing. Then you can see whatever you said, mean gradient. And there is also what is called as PPM. What is PPM?
Patient prosthetic mismatch.
So is it important in mitral?
Yes, sir, it is important in mitral.
Yeah, it's more important in aortic valve.
Okay. More
important aortic valve, but PPM also can occur in mitral valve. And you have to look for regurgitation. How will you make out physiological regurgitation from pathological regurgitation? you have what is physiological regurgitation called as?
Wash jets.
Washing jet.
Washing jets.
Washing jets.
Washing jets.
So how will you know that these washing jets are not actually any problematic thing?
Sorry, sir.
How will you know that it is pathological or physiological, which can be left alone, not to be done anything?
According to the valve manufacturer, there are 2 or 3 washing jets.
Correct, correct. It is valve specific. This signature washing jet for each of the valves. So what are the valves, you know?
Yes, sir. It's a tissue valve and the mechanical valve. And in mechanical,
you have single leaflet and bi-leaflet. Ball and cage we are not using any longer. If previously we used to use ball and cage, now I think they're making it. So how will you make out whether the regurgitation is physiological or pathological?
It will be outside the valve ring if it is pathological.
Yes.
Eccentric jet and more gradient if it is outside the valve of the jets.
Yeah, usually the physiological, what is called washing jets are do not cross the center of the left atrium. They are small, and there's not much of turbulence. They have only the red color. There is no multiple colors in that. It's small and do not usually extend beyond the center of the left atrium, and they're within the wall structure. That is, they are not on the sides of the left atrium, whereas the pathological is outside the sewing ring.
Right.
And they are eccentric and they are bigger than the washing jets. And by looking at various views, you can exactly pinpoint and tell the surgeon there is at the 6 o'clock position or the 9 o'clock position. And then the surgeon might have to go and redo the suture there, put the suture wherever you pointed out. And is there any artery which can be damaged during mitral valve surgery?
Yes, a circumflex artery can be damaged.
Circumflex artery can be damaged, so you have to look for that. And also, as you said, you have to look for the left ventricular function, right ventricular function, pulmonary artery pressure, and any other pathology we can make out. I think with this, I would like to conclude. If you don't mind, is there any question? There is one question here: RT-PCR rapid antigen test and 2 TrueNAT before surgery. What we have found in this hospital is that RT-PCR is better than TrueNAT, because there were 1 or 2 cases where the TrueNAT was negative, but RT-PCR came later than the TrueNAT test, and by that time patient was inside and RT-PCR positive, and patient had problems after that. So RT-PCR is more, reliable as far as our experience goes.
Yes,
so
another
anybody
thing
wants to comment on that?
Yes,
Yeah,
sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Because in TrueNAT, there is a one sample, this oropharyngeal sample is taken. But in RT-PCR, there is a nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal sample are taken. So there, and in gag reflex, sometimes the oropharyngeal sample cannot be taken properly when they are posterior pharynx is in. So there may be the inadequacy of the sample in the TrueNAT testing. I personally feel that I have actually done the RT-PCR test. So that maybe one.
Our experience shows that. Yes. So that is my answer to that. And I would like to conclude if there are no other questions here. Anybody wants to ask any question?
Sir, if there's a mixed lesion, like an MS and MR, with 2 types of murmurs and all, how do we go which is the dominant lesion? Usually we have cases having 2 lesions together only, sir.
Absolutely, very good question. Usually the management is based on which is the dominant lesion. If both lesions are present and equally severe, they will say severe MS, severe MR. We usually take the MS into consideration more than the MR, and usually by echocardiography, we'll know which is the dominant lesion, what is more severe and what is less severe.
Okay, sir. So we manage as per the dominant
By,
lesion, sir.
yeah, dominant lesion.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Sir, I have a question. Sir, what you have mentioned in
Yes,
the case, sir, you have mentioned in the case that patient is having grade 3 mitral regurgitation. Sir, is it a angiographic finding? I mean, the classic
echo. No, it is actually it is moderate MR by echocardiography.
By echo finding.
Angio was not done. As of the history goes, it's only by echo they have written grade 3. It is moderate MR.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Moderate MR, but severe MS.
Yes.
Gradient is 23 severe MS.
Yes, sir. Yes.
And valve area is
0.8 centimeters square.
So that's 0.8. So it is severe MS.
Okay, sir.
Thank you so much. I had a lovely time with you, and we'll meet again sometime.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Hello. Dr. Chaitali is there or Dr. Rahul?
Rahul sir has left.
Rahul has left, I think. Rahul.
So I thank on behalf of WBCTVA Dr. Muralidhar sir. Very, very nice comprehensive interactions with our students. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. End हो गया, मैं मीटिंग कॉल कर दूं।